Hi everyone, welcome to the first series of 2025. As a reminder, my name is Brooke Tully, and I'm here to help you use behavioral insights and communication strategies to motivate action for the planet. Thank you so much for joining me here today. This series is called the Behavior Change Trio, and I'll start with a personal anecdote to explain what this series is all about. Let's go back a decade when I was providing social marketing support to international teams addressing community-based fishing practices. I will never forget the moment when a colleague mentioned that their program includes 27 different behavior changes. And honestly, I don't remember the exact number that they shared, but it's lodged in my brain as 27 for some reason. 27 different behaviors. I asked them to share examples of the behaviors they were addressing, and the list included items like get a fishing license and renew it annually, register their fishing boats, only fish in approved fishing zones, avoiding the no-take zone, fish using approved legal fishing gear, record the fish they caught in their logbook and share it with the catch monitoring team, participate in quarterly Fisher Association meetings, attend fish catch monitoring training workshops, and the list went on. Now, while reviewing this list, I started to feel that not all the behaviors were the same. So take registering a fishing boat with a local government unit, for example. Yes, we need people to do that, but it didn't feel like a behavior to me the way fish using approved gear did. And we know from experience that encouraging an entire community of fishers to only use hook and line gear was a long-term, complex undertaking. Getting those same fishers to register their boats felt more straightforward. At the time, I didn't fully understand the mixed, swirling thoughts this conversation sparked in me. And the best I could offer my colleague at the time was to consider some of the behaviors as one-offs. It's something we need them to do. Whereas the other items required more support and resources throughout the entire timeline to get them done. All right, now let's fast forward to late 2018 when I decided to develop my methodology for designing behavior change programs. And this happened after the Society for Conservation Biology's first conservation marketing conference for those who were there and those who I had met while I was there. Well, I knew I needed to answer the question, what is a behavior? The idea that not all behaviors are the same continued to nag at me. I got as far as distinguishing actions from behaviors in the first two Making Moves courses I delivered in 2019. This simplified approach was helpful, as it did separate items like register your fishing boat from fish using approved gear. But it still felt incomplete. Thankfully, I stumbled across a blog written by Nir Eyal. He's a behavior change expert about habits and routines. And at that point, the light bulbs finally clicked on for me. Today, I teach Making Moves participants about 3 different types of behaviors: actions, routines, and habits. Some behavior change programs have all 3 behaviors, like the Community-Based Fishing Project, while other projects have primarily actions or maybe are even chock full of habits. And regardless of a program's behavior combination, the critical element is tailoring our outreach messages and engagement strategies to each type. That's right, each type. Our choice of messages and our frequency of outreach must adjust per behavior change type to ensure we're providing audiences with the support and motivation they need to continue moving forward. So that's the setup, and we are officially going to start the series today, next, with actions. Are you ready? Okay, great. Let's kick it off with actions. So actions are steps in a behavior journey that can be completed as a single task. And as a reminder, behavior journeys represent the entire sequence of steps that audience members will likely take when they transition from their current behavior or transition from the status quo to adopting a new, more sustainable behavior. And actions are steps in that journey that can be completed as a single task. Typically, they are time bound, meaning they must be completed by a specific date or before the next step in the behavior change process. Once the action has been completed, the audience doesn't have to spend much time thinking about that task until it needs to happen again, which is usually like a year or more away. So, some examples of actions in our everyday lives include voting, getting the annual flu and COVID shots, renewing your driver's license or passport, and registering for a conference. These tasks are all important actions to take, and once you've completed them, you get to move on to something else. Box checked, done. Now, if you're wondering how to spot actions in your project, here are some indications that you have one or more actions in your behavior journey. Check to see if your audience needs to complete a prerequisite step before they can proceed with the rest of the process. So, in the sustainable fishing example I described earlier, fishers must get a license and register their boats as prerequisites for joining the association and fishing legally in the area. Similarly, voters must register to vote or check their voter registration status before election day arrives. So these are prerequisite tasks that need to get done before the audience can move on to the next thing. Another indicator, your audience should complete a series of setup steps to create a foundation for getting more involved. Some projects require a bunch of actions at the start to get audiences prepped for a longer behavior change process. For example, if we want restaurants to start composting food waste, they will need to take a series of initial startup steps to identify a compost hauler, acquire the necessary bins, get the signage, and then set it all up in their restaurant before they even get into the steps of implementing a composting process for the team or even getting buy-in from the team for doing composting. In situations like these, actions may not actually appear again in the project after those initial action steps, but there's a bunch of them at the start that we've got to get everyone through in order to achieve our goals. Another indicator, the audience must complete a task by a deadline so that the project can proceed to the next phase. Examples include signing a petition by a specific date, registering for a webinar before it goes live, or attending an in-person discussion or event. In these cases, the project's next ask for the audience is dependent on whether they've completed the action. In other words, when the audience completes the task, it kind of unlocks the next step of the behavior journey. Actions will typically appear in the early stages of the behavior change process, but that is not a hard and fast rule. They can occur at any point in the journey. In fact, inserting and adding actions at various points in the project can help keep the audience engaged and motivated. So if you've been looking through your behavior change project and you can't seem to spot any actions in your project, you may need to create some. And yes, we can create actions. Early actions can be used as invitations that pique the audience's interest and make them want to learn more about the initiative. Check out my previous podcast episode titled Terms of Engagement, Chapter 1, The Invitation. This is a great resource to help you brainstorm different actions you can add, either at the start of your project or somewhere in the middle to keep your audience engaged. And while actions may seem straightforward to complete, it does not mean there aren't barriers to making them happen. Let's look at the top 3 challenges audience members face with completing actions. 1, forgetfulness. Wasn't there something I was supposed to do today? Since actions don't come around very often, it's easy for audience members to forget that they signed up for something or that they're supposed to be somewhere right now. So forgetfulness is a big one. Also, uncertainty. Are there going to be breakout rooms in this webinar? If so, I'm not sure I want to be there. If the instructions for completing the action are unclear or the expectations are ambiguous, like the breakout room example, audience members may feel uncertain, uncomfortable, or insecure about following through with the task. And the third barrier to completing an action is our good old reliable favorite, status quo bias. So like, whatever, man, I don't really feel like going to this event today. While we as project leaders believe each action is critical for the audience to do, they may not feel the same way. When the audience doesn't perceive the value, benefits, or importance of completing the task, they may decide to skip it when the time comes around. And in order to overcome these barriers, and there are others, I will admit these are just the top 3 that tend to come up. They tend to be the most universal, but there are many, many other likely barriers that will surface. And in order to overcome these barriers, the audience needs us to provide messages that are short and straight to the point, and use outreach plans that include plenty of repetition to keep the actions top of mind. These 3 elements are key to making actions happen. Element number 1, clarity. It's imperative to keep the call to action focused on the single task you want the audience to complete at that moment. And I believe in clarity of calls to action all the time, but it's especially important for actions. Your instructions and deadlines must be crystal clear to reduce that barrier of uncertainty. And if the action is new to your audience, consider creating infographics to demonstrate how the steps should be completed. We are visual learners, so the more visual we can make it, the more likely they are to follow through. Consider installing signage and markers to provide clear directions to the audience when they arrive at a physical location. I talk about this a little bit in a previous podcast episode on choice architecture, but this can really be a last-minute deterrent if someone wants to show up to your event and they can't figure out where they're supposed to park, and it starts to spike that uncertainty. They may not show up. So we want to make sure that clarity is always there. Element number 2, value. We should reinforce the benefits, purpose, and desired outcomes of taking action to overcome status quo bias. We can do this by sharing what the audience gets out of taking action. Make it personal and meaningful to them. Like the restaurant owner example before. Maybe they'll receive free compost bins if they call their compost hauler by a specific date. That ups the ante and increases the value and makes it more likely for them to follow through. And we should also showcase how their individual actions add to bigger impact or contributes to a larger goal. Let's say for petition signing, we can say your signature brings us one step closer to securing wildlife protections. Right? Your action, taking the step, makes a difference. Therefore, don't skip it. Don't let status quo bias get in the way. And lastly, for increasing the value and reinforcing the value of actions, we can find ways to make the action fun to do and validate their efforts once they've completed the action. So it's more enticing and then it's more rewarding afterwards. Okay, element number 3, and it might actually be number 3 through 5, which is reminders. Reminders are needed to emphasize the deadline and urgency of completing the task. This helps the audience prioritize it. This can actually be an area where the scarcity tactic can be leveraged since actions are time limited, which is one of the criteria for using scarcity. And guess what? There's a podcast episode on using the scarcity tactic if you missed it. So please check that out if you want to dive into what scarcity is and how to use it. In addition to us reminding the audience, we can also recommend ways the audience can help remember it themselves. So you can suggest they save it to their calendar or write it on a sticky note and stick it to their fridge. Save the postcard you sent. Voting notices do this all the time. Or they can even ask a friend or dial a friend to remind them when the time comes. Increasing the frequency of messages by utilizing different outreach touchpoints and multiple outreach touchpoints. And when I say touchpoints, I mean things like email, social media, text messages, etc. Increasing the frequency of those and using multiple touchpoints will help keep the task top of mind for the audience. After a while, they might start ignoring the emails. And as the deadline of the action approaches, ramp up the frequency of your messages even more to increase excitement, build momentum, and secure attendance. I know sometimes it can feel awkward to do that, to ramp up the frequency, but in the end, it's actually really helpful for our audience because it really keeps it top of mind for them and helps them follow through on something that they want to. So the combination of clarity, value, and reminders will help audiences check the action box when the time comes. And here's an action for you. Find one example of an action in your project and develop at least 2 ideas for how you can tailor your message and tailor your outreach approach accordingly. And if you can't find any action, use that podcast I mentioned, Terms of Engagement, Chapter 1, Invitation. You can also check out Chapter 2, The Conversation. That might help come up with ideas for actions that you can add. I hope you enjoyed this first episode about activating audiences to take action. Stay tuned for the next one on routines. Thanks for listening. Take care.